Puyi, Part 2, Reginald Johnston, Expulsion from the Forbidden City, and Grooming by the Japanese. This is a second installment that looks into the complicated and often misunderstood life of Puyi, the boy emperor that held the position of supreme authority at the time that Imperial China came to an end. The first part of this mini-series looked at the privileged upbringing of Puyi, while in this video we look at the next stage of his life. Relationship with Reginald Johnston. On the 3rd of March 1919, the Scottish scholar and diplomat Reginald Johnston arrived in the Forbidden City to serve as Puyi's tutor. President Xu Shishang believed the monarchy would be restored, and to prepare Puyi, Johnston had been hired to teach subjects such as political science, constitutional history, and English to prepare Puyi for the modern world. Johnston was only allowed 5 texts in English to give Puyi to read, including Alice in Wonderland and translations into English of the 4 great books of Confucianism. But Johnston disregarded the rules and taught his student about world history with a special emphasis on British history. Puyi was often also taught philosophy as well as the topic of monarchies over republics. Puyi later commented that his tutor's piercing blue eyes made him feel uneasy. Johnston was intimidating, but this caused Puyi to study like a good boy, not daring to do other things when he got bored, as he had with his previous Chinese tutors. Johnston became the only person capable of controlling Puyi. The Scotsman had much more influence than his title of English tutor would suggest, as the eunuchs began to rely on Johnston to steer Puyi away from his capricious moods. The academic later wrote a report addressed to the British authorities and mentioned that the boy had excellent manners, although he has been spoiled due to the nonsense and futility that surround him. Johnston added that there was no hope that Puyi would emerge unscathed from the moral dangers unless he can be removed from the influence of the hordes of eunuchs and other useless officials who are his only companions. The best course of action, Johnston noted, would be to remove him from the Forbidden City and live in the Summer Palace, where he could live a less artificial and happier life. Despite studying Manchu for years, Puyi only knew one word in the language, Yili, or arise. Puyi himself admitted it was the worst subject he studied. Marriage. In March 1922, the Dowager Consorts decided that Puyi should be married and gave him a selection of photographs of aristocratic teenage girls to choose from. First, Puyi chose Wenqiu as his wife, but he was told she was only acceptable as a concubine, so he would have to choose again. Eventually, he chose Wanrong, the daughter of one of Manchuria's richest aristocrats who had been educated in English by American missionaries in Tianjin. On the 15th of March 1922, it was announced officially in the newspapers, and 2 days later, Wanrong took the train to Beijing. On the 6th of April, Puyi went to the Qing family shrine to announce his future marriage later that year. The couple did not meet until their wedding ceremony. The marriage ceremony took place on the 21st of October 1922 and began with the offering of gifts, including 18 sheep, 2 horses, 40 pieces of satin, and 80 rolls of cloth being sent from the Forbidden City to Wanrong's house. After the wedding ceremony was complete, Puyi, his bride Wanrong, and his secondary consort Wenqiu, whom he married on the same evening, went to the Palace of Earthly Tranquility, where everything was coloured red, the colour of love in China, and where emperors traditionally consummated their marriages. Puyi, who was sexually inexperienced and timid, allegedly fled from the bridal chamber, having failed to consummate his marriage on his wedding night. It was later noted that perhaps it was too much to expect an adolescent permanently surrounded by eunuchs to show the sexual maturity of a normal 17-year-old. Puyi had not been given any advice on sexual matters. This sort of thing was simply not done where emperors were concerned. It would have been an appalling breach of protocol. Despite his inexperience, the inference was that Puyi was either impotent, extraordinarily immature sexually, or already aware of his homosexual tendencies. Puyi's youngest brother remembered how Puyi and Wan Rong loved to race their bicycles through the Forbidden City, forcing eunuchs to hurriedly get out of the way. Despite the lack of sexual relations, there was a lot of laughter as they seemed to get on well, like kids playing together. One of Puyi's last surviving eunuchs in 1986 stated that the emperor would come to the nuptial apartments once every 3 months and stay the night. Puyi would leave in the early morning and would always be in a foul mood the following day. Another eunuch who served as Wan Rong's personal servant later wrote in his memoir of a rumor circulating among the eunuchs that Puyi was gay. After the Great Kanto earthquake of September 1923 destroyed the cities of Tokyo and Yokohama, Puyi donated £33,000 worth of jade antiques to pay for disaster relief, which led to a delegation of Japanese diplomats to visit the Forbidden City to express their gratitude. In their report about the visit, the diplomats noted that Puyi was highly vain and malleable, and that he could be used by Japan. This became the beginning of Japanese interest in Puyi. Expulsion from the Forbidden City in 1924. On the 23rd of October 1924, a coup led by the warlord Feng Yuxiang took control of Beijing. Feng was the latest of the warlords to take the city and was seeking political legitimacy, and decided the abolishment of the unpopular Articles of Favourable Settlement was an easy way to seek the approval of the people. On the 5th of November 1924, Feng revised the article, and in doing so abolished the right of Puyi to hold his imperial title, thus reducing him to a private citizen of the Republic of China. On the same day, Puyi was expelled from the Forbidden City and given just 3 hours to leave. Puyi spent a few days at the house of his father, Prince Chun, before temporarily residing at the Japanese embassy in Beijing. He went to the embassy without informing his father or his mentor, Johnston, although Johnston had ultimately been in favour of such a move, as he felt the Japanese worshipped their emperor as a living god and steered Puyi towards those ideals. The Japanese diplomat Kenkichi Yoshizawa stated that the Japanese government would provide protection for Puyi, and later Puyi's advisor Liu Zhongyu, who was secretly working for the Japanese, suggested Puyi move to Tianjin, which he felt was a safer option than the Chinese capital. However, it was later revealed that the Japanese felt it would be easier to control Puyi in Tianjin without him staying in the Japanese legation, which was proving to be an embarrassment while straining the relations between the two countries. On the 23rd of February 1925, Puyi left Beijing and took the train to Tianjin. Puyi later described the journey as being one that at every stop encountered on the journey, more Japanese police and special agents boarded the train, so that by the time they arrived in Tianjin, the carriage was more than half full of Japanese there to offer him protection. Residence in Tianjin, 1925 to 1931. Puyi arrived at the Japanese concession of Tianjin in February 1925 and lived at first in the Zhang Garden before moving in 1929 into the former residence of Liu Zhongyu, known as the Garden of Serenity. Tianjin was, after Shanghai, the most cosmopolitan city in China, with large communities of British, French, German, Russian and Japanese people. As an emperor, Puyi was permitted into several social clubs that normally only admitted non-Chinese. It was during this period that Puyi, together with his advisors, discussed plans to restore the monarchy. In June 1925, the warlord Zhang Zuolin visited Puyi. An illiterate former bandit, Zhang ruled Manchuria and, after kowtowing to the former emperor, promised to help restore the House of Qing if Puyi made a financial contribution to his army. Zhang also warned Puyi not to trust his Japanese friends. In June 1927, Zhang captured Beijing and, had Puyi shown more courage at that time and also returned to Beijing, he might have been returned to the throne. Puyi also allegedly stated that same year that he never wished to be emperor again. Puyi and his court were easily manipulated as he attempted to back various warlords, which strained his relations with Zhang Zuolin. Puyi met with another Zhang, this one Zhang Zongchang, who Puyi later described as a universally detested monster, who promised to return Puyi to the Dragon Throne if he was given enough money. However, any money Zhang received from Puyi was kept for his personal gain. Another conman that benefited from the generosity of Puyi was Russian émigré general Grigory Semyonov, who also promised to restore Puyi to the throne in exchange for a loan of £5,000, a loan that was never repaid. Semyonov proved to be a talented conman, claimed to have several Cossack hosts under his control, to have 300 million rubles in the bank, and be supported by American, British and Japanese banks. Another visitor to the Garden of Serenity was General Kenji Doihara, an officer in the Japanese army who was fluent in Mandarin and full of charm and flattery, telling Puyi that a great man such as himself should conquer Manchuria just as his Qing ancestors had done centuries before, and use Manchuria as a base for conquering the rest of China. In 1928, during the Northern Expedition to reunify China, Sun Tianjin, a warlord who had switched allegiances from Zhang Zuolin to Chiang Kai-shek after Grooming had taken Beijing from Zhang, Sun had sacked the Qing tombs outside the capital, and news of the plunder and desecration of Empress Dowager Cici's tomb in particular deeply offended Puyi. Puyi never forgave the Kuomintang for this act and held Chiang Kai-shek personally responsible. Chiang had not taken part in the raid, but there were allegations that the leaders of the Kuomintang had accepted bribes from the looting. This incident, together with Puyi's political impotence, greatly contributed to his decision to turn his support towards the Japanese. During his time in Tianjin, Puyi was besieged with visitors asking for money, while his first wife Wan Rong continued to smoke opium recreationally. Their marriage began to fall apart as they continued to spend less of their time together, often only meeting at mealtimes. Wan Rong complained that her life as an empress was dull, and the rules for such a role forbade her from going out dancing as she would have liked. The westernized Wan Rong was totally alien to the traditions of which she was bound. She resented having to play the role of a traditional Chinese empress, a role that was purely symbolic. Puyi's butler, a Japanese spy, reported to his masters of an argument between the couple lasting hours, in which she screamed that Puyi was a eunuch. Whether this was meant as an insult to his sexual inadequacy was unclear. In 1931, Puyi's concubine Wen Shou declared that she had had enough of him and simply walked out while filing for divorce. Captive in Manchuria, 1931 to 1932. In September 1931, Puyi sent a letter to Jiro Minami, the Japanese Minister of War, expressing his desire to be restored to the throne. On the night of the 18th of September 1931, the Mukden incident began when Japan's Kwantung Army blew up a section of railway and blamed the explosion on the Chinese warlord Zhang Shuliang. On this pretext, the Kwantung Army began an offensive with the aim of conquering all of Manchuria. Puyi was visited by Kenji Doihara, the head of the Japanese espionage office of the Kwantung Army. He proposed that Puyi be positioned at as the head of a Manchurian state. He later pressed Puyi by claiming that a contract was out to take Puyi's life. The Empress Wanrong was firmly against Puyi's plans to go to Manchuria, an act she called treason, which led to Puyi's becoming hesitant. Toihara then sent for Yoshiko Kawashima, also known as the Eastern Jewel or Dongzhen, to visit Puyi and change his mind. Yoshiko was a strong-willed, flamboyant, openly bisexual woman who wore male clothing and uniforms. In the Tianjin incident of November 1931, Puyi and Zhong Xiaochu travelled to Manchuria to complete plans for the puppet state of Manchukuo. Puyi left his house by hiding in the boot of a car before boarding a Japanese ship to cross the Bohai Sea to Port Arthur, now Lushan. The Chinese government, meanwhile, ordered the arrest of Puyi for treason, but was unable to breach the protection offered by Japan. On his arrival in Port Arthur, Puyi was met by the man who would become his minder, General Masahiko Amakasu. Amakasu was a fearsome man who informed Puyi he would strangle him if he became an enemy of the Japanese emperor. Once he arrived in Manchuria, Puyi quickly discovered he was a prisoner and was not allowed outside his residence at the Yamato Hotel. The reason, it was claimed, was for his protection from assassination. Wanrong had remained in Tianjin and remained opposed to Puyi's decision to work with the Japanese. The Eastern Jewel then travelled several times to visit Wanrong and for her to go to Manchuria to be with Puyi. Historians claim that had Wanrong been of stronger character, she would have remained in Tianjin and filed for divorce, but ultimately she consented to go, and 6 weeks after the Tianjin incident, she too crossed the Bohai Sea to Port Arthur and was reunited with her husband. In early 1932, General Shishiro Itagaki informed Puyi that the new state was to be a republic with him as the chief executive. The capital was to be Changchun. His form of address was to be Your Excellency, not Your Imperial Majesty, all of which displeased Puyi. There were no references to the mandate of heaven, and the suggestion that Manchukuo was to be based on popular sovereignty, with the people asking that Puyi ruled over them, was completely in contrast to Puyi's ideals of his right to rule according to the mandate of heaven. Ikagi suggested to Puyi that in a few years Manchukuo might become a monarchy and that Manchuria was just the beginning, as Japan had plans to take all of China. The obvious implication was that Puyi would become the great Qing emperor once again. When Puyi objected to Itagaki's plans, he was told that he was in no position to negotiate, as Itagaki had no interest in his opinions on these issues. Unlike Toihara, who was always very polite and constantly stroked Puyi's ego, Itagaki was brutally rude and brusque, barking out orders as if to a particularly dim-witted common soldier. Itagaki had further promised Puyi's chief advisor Zhong Xiaochu that he would be the Manchukuo prime minister. This was an offer that appealed to the vanity of the advisor, enough that he would make sure Puyi accepted the terms of the Japanese, even telling Puyi that it would soon become a monarchy and history would repeat itself, as together they would conquer the rest of China just as the Qing had done in 1644. Japanese propaganda always labelled Puyi as a traditionalist in terms of a Confucian sage king, out to restore virtue, as a revolutionary who would end the oppression of the common people by a program of wholesale modernization. That brings us to the end of this video, highlighting this period of the life story of Puyi, the Xuantong Emperor, whose quest to be restored as emperor took several extraordinary twists throughout his life. Look out for the next installment in this fascinating story. If you've enjoyed watching and it's shown you a little detail of life and events here in China, then Your subscribing to my channel would mean a lot to me. Thank you for watching. Make sure you click on the link to the next video, and until the next time, goodbye for now.